Hello, you are listening to Poured Over, the Barnes& Noble podcast. My name is Chris Gillespie. This is a very special episode of Poured Over because today you, the listener, are getting two hosts for the price of one. I'm joined now by my colleague and fellow Poured Over guest host, Isabelle McConville. Isabelle, how are you doing?
Oh, great. How you doing today, Chris?
I'm doing very well. As I was reading the book that we're about to discuss, I kept thinking about how much I was looking forward to talking to our guest today, but I was also extremely curious to hear your perspective on it as someone who was born in the 21st century. Although I'm not that much older than you, I am old enough to really remember nearly everything that's covered in the book in a way that might make me a bit biased towards certain aspects of it. So thank you for agreeing to be here and offering your insight and covering my blind spots. I think it's going to be a lot of fun.
Yes, of course. I'm just hoping I can be helpful here.
So with that in mind, what do you say? Shall we bring in our guest for today?
Let's do it.
All right. Our guest today is a longtime culture writer based in Tokyo, whose work has appeared in such publications as The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The New Republic, Vox, and many more. He's also the author of Status and Culture: How Our Desire for Social Rank Creates Taste, Identity, Art, Fashion, and Constant Change. He's got a fantastic new book out this November. It's called Blank Space: A Cultural History of the 21st Century. W. David Marx, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored by the host to guest ratio.
Well, it's the least we could do. We had to roll out the red carpet for someone who's joining us from very far away. I don't know if it might be the furthest away that we've ever done one of these episodes, but so the listener knows you live in Tokyo. You're coming to us right now from Tokyo.
That's right. It is the next day in Tokyo at 9 a.m.
How long have you lived over there? How do you like it? What brought you over there? I'm so curious.
So yeah, I've been here since 2003, and initially I had studied Japanese in college, and then I moved here to get a master's degree in consumer behavior, which explains both my previous books. So my first book is about the history of American fashion in Japan, and then the second
Mhm.
book was more of a broader kind of look at the universal principles and laws that move culture and make culture happen. And so both of those come out of I think that experience of being out of my birth location of the United States and moving to Japan and kind of seeing how American culture gets adapted and changed, and then also so what are the general rules of why culture works, and it's much easier to see that once you get out of your own culture. And so but yeah, I mean, I've been here a long time, and I study Japanese, and so it's, I think, one of the inconveniences for people moving here is often language, but I worked hard to overcome that. And then it's just a pretty calm, nice place, and it's I think in recent years somewhere where you still see a lot of what I would call craftsperson mindset. So
Mm.
products are really high quality, meals are really high quality, but more than that, you go to a restaurant and it's incredibly popular and only has 8 seats. And you kind of think, why wouldn't you expand this? Why wouldn't this be a massive franchise chain across the country? And the mindset is just like, no, we want to do an 8-person place. And so it's just really nice to live in a city that feels like it's an infinite number of those kind of establishments.
That's awesome. And it is in direct opposition to our American mindset that's been drilled into us of, oh, we can turn this into a franchise. We can make money off of this. Don't just respect the thing as a good experience. Like, how can we make this more lucrative? That is, I feel like, inherently American in all of us, even if we don't acknowledge it all the time.
That's right.
I had really enjoyed reading Blank Space because not only was a fun, nostalgic trip for me as someone who really came of age during this time, but it's also such a thoughtful and insightful analysis of how our, current culture came to be. There's a quote on the back cover from actor and humorist BJ Novak, who said that reading your book was the first time that this century made any sense to him, which I completely agree with. There's something very satisfying about getting to see all of these disparate parts of the past 25 years kind of come together and be organized and arranged in a way that really highlights patterns and trends and the causality of things. I imagine it was a huge undertaking. So I'm curious to hear what first inspired you to write a cultural history of the past 25 years. When did you start it? How long did it take? What was that initial inspiration?
So So my second book, Status and Culture, I had originally thought about it as almost two books, and the first book would be the general principles of how culture works, and then the second book would be how the internet changed everything, because the
Mm,
internet really has changed the parameters of how cultural production happens, and the pace of trends. The trends get so fast that they kind of don't form at all, and principles like that. Um, and I ended up for the book having to put all of that second book in basically one chapter. I just kind of crammed it in. And as I thought about what I wanted to do next, I really liked the approach of the first book I did, which was just a straight linear history, and you kind of follow certain characters, and you go from the 60s to the 70s, the 80s to the 90s, and it's really easy for a reader to understand because you're just kind of moving through history. And so I thought it would be equally useful to look at this century from that lens of starting in 2001 and ending now, and just moving linearly through it. And I grew up on all these, whether it was Life magazine or TV specials about here's the 60s and here's the 70s and here's the 80s. And, you know, in the last 25 years have really regretted the fact there hasn't been these moments where we stop and say, okay, those were the aughts, or these were the teens. We don't even have a name for the 2010s, right?
mm.
And so enough had happened where it felt like, well, we should at least take a pause here at 25 years and try to clock what happened in those 25 years and see whether this period at least holds up as a moment of transformative change the same way that the 60s were or the 70s did. And so I think it was a lot more to cram into a book than from, you know, a 10-year period. And I had to write it in about 11 months in order to get it out by 2025. So it was a really intense process. But I think it was helpful that, you know, I had lived through this period and obviously knew these things and didn't have to do deep research. But I think just lining up the 25 years and making you relive it as one narrative has a lot of value in itself. And you can disagree with my analysis, or you can disagree with. Um, I think that the book definitely has a lot of places you could quibble with, but just no one had done that yet of kind of putting it all together and looking at the changes. And you know, BJ is right that it, you know, or BJ, I'm honored that he thinks that he can understand this, you know, period after reading the book. But at the same time, I almost finished it and felt like I just wrote a book about the 21st century and I don't even understand it, that it is still so complicated, and things are moving so quickly, even
Mm.
since I put my pen down, right? I got my last edits on the book, I think in March or April. And even since then, boy, the world feels like it's changed. So it's a really hard period to pin down, but at least as a first draft of kind of what we live through and to understand and for other people to react to, I think hopefully it's useful.
Absolutely. I think it's a very noble and effective attempt at that. I cannot speak highly enough about it. Once I finished it, I was talking to everyone in my life about it, and I was like, "Don't you see? This is what this is what's been going on. It all makes sense now." And I think it's really required reading for anybody who has existed in the 21st century, which is partially how I roped Isabelle into reading it and co-hosting this episode with me. Isabelle, as a member of Gen Z, I know you cannot speak for everyone of your generation, but what was your experience like reading this book?
I won't speak for everyone of my generation, but I will also quote Hannah Horvath. I am a voice of my generation. It was eye-opening. It was very eye-opening. It can be hard, I think, to find perspective when you're so close to something. And obviously, the 21st century is all I've ever known. You know, we had computer class in elementary school. I had my first smartphone when I was in middle school, my first Instagram account by the time I was a teenager. It's all I've ever known. You know, I very seamlessly grew up into this internet boom, I guess you could say. And it was so interesting to see those years reflected back at me on the page. Obviously, like you were saying, David, I don't think that this has ever been done before. It was just truly eye-opening, is what would say to describe it. And David, in your introduction, we learn about Pearl Jam in the 90s and how they rejected this idea of mainstream success because they didn't want to be seen as sellouts. And I thought that that was so interesting, truly first because I know Pearl Jam songs. I don't know much about them as a band, unfortunately. So that was news to me. I didn't know that. Um, and also just this idea of them being seen as sellouts because I was telling Chris this earlier. I was having a conversation with a friend recently where we were just talking about how people aren't seen as sellouts anymore. We don't say that enough anymore. You
Yep.
know, we have Oscar-winning actors and actresses in commercials for phone companies or in commercials for, huge brands that really don't need them as the face of them. And so why don't we call them out more? And I've had that thought and then saw this in your book, and especially how you juxtapose Pearl Jam's rejection of this mainstream success with DJ Diesel, CEO of Goldman Sachs. So that was also eye-opening to me. Um, and I wonder if you can tell me a little bit about how you knew you wanted to start the book there and why you wanted that to be your introduction.
Yeah, I mean, so I grew up in the 90s. I mean, those were the formative years for me. And I think the thing about Pearl Jam, I wasn't the biggest fan of Pearl Jam then, and I'm still, not a huge Pearl Jam fan. But when Pearl Jam decided we're never going to make a music video again because music videos made us too popular, it
Hmm.
was a mildly shocking thing for them to do. I think the logic of that decision made perfect sense in the culture at the time. And so just I had been thinking about that. I guess I read Chuck Klosterman's in the 90s, and he talks a bit about that and the concept of selling out. And of course, selling out is dead, and it's been dead for quite a bit. And I tried to track kind of in the book where it dies, and I would even position that about 2001. Vice magazine's already saying selling out is this old concept, and we need to destroy it. But just that the idea that Pearl Jam did that, and it was so obvious to the values that they lived in. And then you go forward to Goldman Sachs CEO spinning at Lollapalooza. And this was something I had to look up 3 or 4 times because no one seemed to notice or care. There wasn't one of these things even making fun of, I can't believe the CEO of Goldman Sachs is spinning at Lollapalooza. I mean, it was just this non-story. And so the fact that Lollapalooza would even invite him and that it was nobody cared and it really wasn't a cultural moment at all because that was as equally obvious in our culture. I just felt like that was a very strong contrast of, yes, in 30 years, we've moved and had this big value shift. And so the book, I mean, ultimately goes through all these events of from 2001 to 2025. But what I'm looking at is these major value shifts. And I would say they, overall kind of go up to the idea that culture and money are incredibly interwoven. And if not money, it's politics, right? So culture, there's been a lot of talk about cultural stasis and culture is over. And I think when you read the book, you realize that there's a lot of things happening. Like there's a lot of culture. There's probably more people producing culture than ever before in the history of the world. So in terms of your access to culture and people's creation of new things, there's no question about that. But there is this feeling that culture has become a vehicle for pure entertainment, has become a vehicle for money making, and has become a vehicle for politics on both the left and the right. And so that that Pearl Jam versus David Solomon anecdote just for me summarized kind of these were two things that would never happen in either era, right? That you wouldn't have a band like Pearl Jam get popular and say, okay, done, we're done being popular, and you wouldn't certainly in Lollapalooza 1992 have had anyone from Goldman Sachs probably even at the festival.
And I think one of the main themes that I got from the book, I feel like one of the threads that you do kind of trace throughout it is this idea of this merging of art and commerce, like you're saying, and that by the time we get to the CEO of Goldman Sachs performing at Lollapalooza, those two have already been fully merged. You can have commercial and financial success, probably way too much financial success to some measure, and still get to enjoy in this kind of or participate in this art and making entertainment and music and all these things. There is no separation of the two. No one, like you said, is even commenting on it or writing stories about it. I was wondering how, because to some extent there's always been ambitious artists who always want to make a lot of money and really want to be famous and have all of that. Obviously, the grunge scene in the 90s kind of changed that a little bit, where it was no longer cool to have all that stuff. But how is the merging of art and commerce, specifically in the past 25 years, how is that different from anything that we've seen before? Because I mean, artists have had sponsorships or they've had ambitions for all of time, but it seems to be that there's a different version of it that's happened over the past 25 years.
Right. And so if you look at Jimmy Buffett, who was a massively popular singer starting in the 20th century. I think he died as a billionaire, right? So you had people in a previous generation who turned their art very quickly into a hamburger chain and a very lucrative tour and knew how to do the business side of it. So I don't think that's new. I think what changed is the degree to which that was not seen as a bad thing, and or that it was seen as particularly progressive or noble, that people were aiming for success. And so in the book, and success by which I mean financial success. So the financial success was not following from artistic success or respect, but it actually was, was leading it. And so in the book, I talk about the value shift to poptimism, and this is a word that any critic who's been called a poptimist loathes, and they say it doesn't exist, and it's really controversial, and I'm sympathetic to some of the critique. But there has been this value shift, which is that if you are an artist and you are aiming to be incredibly popular, and that's your ticket towards being financially successful, that there's not only nothing wrong with that, but perhaps it's actually the more righteous thing to have done, because you're bringing more joy to more people. It's a more democratic act. And who are we to say that these artists shouldn't cater to the taste of their fans? Who are we to say that they shouldn't make money? So I think that the difference has been that a Taylor Swift, who, there's a book this year coming out about her being an incredible poet, and there's a book this year coming out about her being an incredible businesswoman, that someone like Taylor Swift, who from the very beginning has very, very savvily managed their career to get into the $1 billion, asset range, that is seen as, in some ways, a compliment to the music itself rather than something detrimental to it. And so I think it's like that value shift that accepts the commerce as part of the art or an exciting part of the celebrity, or what makes Taylor Swift a cultural phenomenon. You can't take the billions of dollars away from that. I think that's the difference, not necessarily that people for the first time decided to make money from culture.
Also, speaking of the kind of the shifting values, what role do you think the internet, social media, smartphones, all of that technology had in the direction that those values shifted? Because value shifting, I'm no sociologist, but I feel like that's a very complex, difficult thing that probably takes a lot of time. But it seems that if we're just looking at the 90s versus today, that's only a 30-year range, sort of, that we've had this big transition. What do you attribute that value change to?
So I think until now, everyone has very quickly said it is the internet's fault, and it's late stage capitalism, or however you want to call it, but just this hyper globalized capitalist system we live in that creates these values. Those are not wrong. But what I tried to show with the book is that starting in 2001, Vice magazine wasn't necessarily the most influential media across the 21st century, but you already see at Vice kind of green shoots of anti-liberal sentiment powering coolness, which I think really, crosses the entire century. And then also this idea that making money is cool, and it's really stupid to be a Puritan about making money, or some sort of art-oriented saint who does it all for the craft rather than the money. So I think you already get that. And then by 2004, you have this very influential essay in the New York Times that is basically saying Christina Aguilera is more punk than a punk artist, and that pop music is more emancipatory or more interesting in the fact that sometimes it's made for money, and that's what makes it good. And so those started far before the internet really, ramps it up even more. So how the internet then takes those kind of sentiments and goes into hyperdrive is, first of all, on YouTube or any of these platforms, everything is quantified in a way that, when I was growing up, you would have some copy of a VHS of some indie film that your older friend told you had to see, and you just had this kind of sense of like, I have to see this because the cool people have seen it, but there was no view count on it. You had no idea whether it was popular or not, and in some ways, if it was unpopular, that was probably better. And now it's like, if someone sent you a video, it's like, you got to see this, and there's 25 views, you'd be like, really, this, like, it has 25 views. So everything gets quantified, and then on top of that, you have, when I graduated from college in 2001, I don't think a single person I knew, even the most openly greedy people going into finance, were thinking, I'm going to be a billionaire one day. Like, we could probably name one billionaire, and it was Bill Gates, and Bill Gates became a billionaire off of making this cruddy software that everybody loathed, and so it was kind of seen as well that he has this like monopoly, and Steve Jobs was the true genius, and Bill Gates ripped him off. That was kind of the narrative at the time. But there was no other billionaire to kind of mark yourself against. And then Zuckerberg, in his late 20s, becomes a billionaire from making a website in a way that I think people thought, oh, I could do that. And then you saw this just list of all these people become billionaires overnight. And so the money got really big, the opportunity got global and huge, and everything became quantified. So it's just from every part of people's experience, money became really the dominating factor for how you would judge yourself against other people. And so I think that it all kind of came together. But again, one of the main points of the book is that it did not happen overnight. I think there was already a backlash against that kind of 90s purism, that in some ways 90s indie music and film had succeeded so much that people felt like we don't have to fight for it. And in some ways it had succeeded so much that it started to feel elitist, and people felt just inherently coolness is always about going against what you see as the oppressive system, and the oppressive system became kind of indie, middle of the road liberalism. And so things, started already splintering from the early 2000s of this contrarianism to either say like right-wing stuff is cool, like Gavin McInnes' advice, or to say pop music is actually, music very intentionally made to just make people money. Manufactured pop is actually the more progressive, exciting form of music rather than rock music.
You're making me think a lot about something that actually Maya Hawke said. So she's one of our famous Nepo babies. Love Maya Hawke. And she said something recently about how she wishes she couldn't care about social media. She wishes she couldn't care about Instagram. But she's been told that if she had a certain amount of followers, her movie would get funded.
Right.
And on another note, it makes me think about Halsey. She's one of my favorite musical artists. And she recently said in an interview with Zane Lowe that she can't make another album right now. Her label is not letting her because her last one didn't sell enough.
Mm-hmm.
How did we get here? And is there a way to get out of it?
I mean, so the other part of this book, I think it gets increasingly depressing as you move forward. I think the last part is particularly bleak, and because it's about monoculture, it's about the rise of the real success of meshing coolness and right-wing ideas that have brought Trump into power, and about techno-nihilism, that it's not just that there's bad actors on the platforms, but we can't trust the platforms at all anymore. And so those are all kind of politically tinged ideas. But anyway, so the end of the book is quite depressing. So I end with some here's some tips, or here's some things we could do to maybe restore culture a bit. And at the end of the day, though, the thing that makes me most optimistic is what you just mentioned, which is that people are starting to realize that they're trapped by these mechanisms. And I would say in 2010, having a smartphone was fun, and you were excited to download apps, and you were excited to use it, and you were excited when your friends were posting things. And now I ran into someone recently, and I keep quoting this. He said, I can't wait till I'm rich enough not to have a smartphone. And that is something that I feel, and I know also incredibly wealthy people who don't have a smartphone and then they have a guy who, takes care of the stuff for them. But that to me seems like a value shift away from where we are at the moment, which is just, I don't have to go out there and religiously tell people like the internet is bad for you, Instagram's bad for you. I think that everyone's just feeling themselves that they are beholden to all these platforms and they're not getting value out of it the way they used to. And so that's just going to make a shift the other direction. And so having a smartphone and being incredibly online and wired was a positive status marker 10, 15 years ago. And now it's becoming a negative status marker. And, AI slop videos, for example, I don't think there's any kind of cachet attached to them. I think it's seen as the opposite, which is that if you're spending your day making and creating AI slop videos, like something must be wrong with you. And so technology is pushing out all these things in which are becoming less cool in a sense. And what's cool is to be at a secret offline party and actually just be talking to people in real life. And so the value shift is already moving that way. And so I think the book does explain pretty well like that kind of slow boiling frog of how we did get here, which is this, that everything became online and the internet it was no longer kind of a sideshow, but it became the main way we lived our lives. But just it peaked. I mean, I really think that in the last couple of years, no one is going around saying what I really need is more internet in my life.
Mm-hmm. Is there I was thinking about how there's sort of one of the other kind of threads that you talk about in the book, and you've mentioned it a few times with kind of how even as early as 2001, you have Vice, the media outlet basically suggesting these ideas of like, oh, well, it's actually not cool to be subscribing to this kind of, feel good, globalized, liberal attitude of, oh, we're all, we're coming out of the Cold War and things are kind of moving in the right direction. We have this new technology, this sort of, that's going to connect us all, and things are moving in this more tolerant thing, and everything's on autopilot. But having the kind of underpinnings of saying, oh, we're going to actually have a little bit more of that kind of far right ideology was already starting to bubble up as early as then. What seems to happen, or what appears to be the case in my reading of the book, is that sort of you trace how subcultures or countercultures eventually grow into the dominant culture. And it seems that we are now living in a phase where a subculture that was happening, like you were saying, that early, far right attitude, even as recently as 5 years ago, it was more distant than it is right now, where it's entered the mainstream, certainly politically. But do you have any idea of how we can kind of foster a new counterculture? Because I feel like right now there's not really, I know that there's a little bit of what we're talking about of people wanting to acknowledge that the internet is maybe not the best place or the best thing for society or psychology, but how do countercultures actually come to be?
Yeah, and so in my other book, I in Status and Culture, I talk a lot about the difference between subcultures and countercultures. And
Mm-hmm.
to me, subcultures, typically were working class delinquent kids or people truly marginalized from society who had to go make their own values, and often those values were created in direct opposition to whatever the mainstream values were. It's the way to say, like, we reject your values and we're going to create our own kind of esteem network. And countercultures do a similar thing, but they do it around a really clear ideology. And so hippies in the 60s really believed in, we're going to create this new kind of communal society that yes, it does reject white collar, white picket fence kind of ideals of the United States, but at the same time, it was in good faith for the most part in saying we're going to go out to a farm and find a way of just like getting past capitalist values and doing all these things. And so if you flash forward today, you no longer have as many very clear subcultures, and they don't exist in the way that like a Teddy Boys or the mods existed in the 60s, in that everything is online. And so
Hmm.
you don't just have people kind of running around cities with this very specific kind of style or music or things like that. At the same time, the countercultures, because people perceive middle of the road liberalism and neoliberal economics to be kind of the dominant theme or the dominant hegemonic uh, underpinnings of society, then the countercultures have become really not from the left, but from the right. And so 4chan to me feels incredibly subcultural, which is that there's a lot of people who just want to say outrageous, shocking things, but 4chan is much more associated with the shocking things being from the right than from being from the left. And so there was a lot of right wing subcultural activity, and one of the issues with the 21st century compared to the 20th is that the fashion industry and the culture industry found it really easy to pick up all these subcultures and countercultures and bring them into culture. And so you have Apple really building their entire brand off of all these kind of radical artists and thinkers. You have Nike using all these 60s, countercultural anthems to sell products. So you have everything kind of swept in. And of course, music labels like, taking Bob Marley and making him a global star. And now it's harder because the activity that's happening on the fringes doesn't really mesh particularly well with the culture industry, the fashion industry. And
Hmm.
it's the primary consumer of goods is still a well-educated professional class person. And so that value system just doesn't mesh at all with kind of reactionary subculture. And so so there's still subcultural activity. There's still people who feel like they're pushed to the margins. But because it's had this right wing uh, kind of overarching right wing uh, anti-liberal sense to it, it's just been really hard to integrate into the consumer culture. So the consumer culture doesn't change that much because it doesn't have access to as many kind of new ideas as it used to.
Shifting gears in a somewhat different direction, is there one particular, and this might be difficult to answer, but is there one particular moment or creative work or person even who you feel like sums up the 21st century so far, if you had to just offer like one encapsulation of it?
I mean, from a negative perspective, you can't ignore the arc of Kanye West to Ye, in the sense that
Hmm.
he started, uh, producing for Jay-Z, gets big. His first album, I believe, had something like 10 Grammy nominations. Massive cultural force in terms of bringing different strands of hip hop together with the whole tradition of black music, within streetwear, within after that Parisian fashion, with um, all these uh, like rock and other genres kind of going on, uh, and stays kind of in the conversation the entire time. And then for him to switch, I mean, I think he was vaguely associated with being somebody on the left, or he had this famous kind of anti-Bush moment after Katrina.
Hmm.
For him to have come out for to be pro-Trump, I think was a mild shock. But then for him to go full Nazi in the last couple of years
Hmm.
was an extreme shock. But I mean, it's very difficult not to look at that arc of just one individual going across these 25 years and not see the entire culture being dragged in those directions. And so I don't think necessarily Kanye now is influential on the culture. I don't think he's making a Nazi. I think he has been sucked into that, but he sees his way of differentiating himself and being rebellious is taking up these nefarious right wing ideas in a way where I think he used to feel like he could be different from just knowing the cool shop in Paris to go to. So I think that's it. That's a tragic story, but it is the story of the 21st century. But I mean, the things that I go back to of the century, uh, something like the musical group 100 Gex, to me sounds like what the 21st century feels like, in that it's just like hyper compressed, a huge mix of all these genres, and it's ironic and stupid sometimes, but it's incredibly intelligent. And so that to me is the thing I would want more of, is just things that it can be polarizing, but they can only be created in the era that we live in, that represent the sound of things we live in. And so, I just saw One Battle After Another, which was a fine movie. I didn't love it, but to say like that's the best movie of the 21st century, it feels like, I mean, this is a director who is very much associated with the 90s and kind of taking that indie spirit. I mean, same with Tarantino, Scorsese, all these great directors are making incredible movies, but, they are taking a kind of aesthetic into the 21st century and still being rewarded for it, rather than creating these, completely brand new aesthetics in the 21st century.
Yeah, it seems like nostalgia just dominates everything that we do and everything that we see. And it just feels like you talk about this a lot in the book, how everything feels like it's sequels or remakes of things that we've seen already. It makes me think about a quote from a book that I really love by Hanif Abdurraqib. He says, nostalgia is a relentless hustler. And ever since I read that, I just think about it constantly, because it truly does feel like nostalgia just comes like a thief in the night and takes over our culture. I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about what you think about nostalgia and how it dominates today.
So I grew up, uh, in the late 80s watching a lot of Nickelodeon, and Nickelodeon, people don't remember this, but at the very beginning didn't have enough programming to fill an entire day. And so at night there was this thing called Nick at Night, and they just reshowed 1950s sitcoms. So it was like the Donna Reed show and My Three Sons. And so ended up watching all this television that no one today would ever watch again. And so, and then a big show at the time was The Wonder Years, which was a show about the 60s, kind of replayed in the 80s. And I loved it. And I felt almost a kindred spirit with the main character, Kevin Arnold, even though he was from 20 years before. And so that was all based off of boomer nostalgia, and it was trying to appeal to baby boomers. I think what is different now is that when we talk about nostalgia, there is always a market for, hey, did you like My Bloody Valentine in the 90s? Go see them again. Or Pavement. I saw Pavement on tour last year, I think. So it's like, okay, I didn't see Pavement in the 90s. Great, I get to go see Pavement. So I think none of that is surprising or even that detrimental. I think that's just kind of how culture works. The difference, and the thing I point out, if you look at a song like Blurred Lines, which was the smash of the year it came out, that song was sued later for sounding too much like a song from the 70s. And if you listen to it, it didn't necessarily sound that much like a song from the 70s, in the sense that you just heard it and said, this is the song of the summer for our year. And it had a slight nostalgic tinge to it, but it wasn't necessarily like trying to appeal to people who grew up on 70s music. It was appealing to young people, because there were no alternative sounds at the time that could compete with the grooves of the 70s. And so I think that's the difference, is that it's not just nostalgia is trying to take money from people to say, do you remember this thing? It's that the 20th century is still cooler than anything in the 21st century. And so when you have a Bob Dylan movie, it's not like, oh, do you remember Bob Dylan? It's like, now that's an artist. It's this kind of hero story that you can't necessarily tell about people in the 21st century. And so you have, I mean, I use this example, maybe it's unfair, but I still see kids in Nirvana t-shirts. I still see kids with a shirt with Kurt Cobain on it, and maybe they've never heard Nirvana and it's just a fashion item. Fine. But Vampire Weekend was a huge band that is beloved, but you don't see people wearing Ezra Koenig t-shirts. Now, maybe it's thankfully that Ezra Koenig is alive, but I think that there's something about the time we live in that just has not reached the iconic status that 20th century culture did. And so the only counterpoint I would give you is, I think if you look at trap is probably the most successful cultural art form of the 21st century, in that it there's kind of hip hop before trap and hip hop after trap. And if you go anywhere in the world and you listen to pop songs, especially in Asia, you'll hear a trap beat, right? So like, and you hear country music, you'll hear a trap beat. So trap was a music that was almost total rejection of 70s grooves, total rejection of samples. It's just raw lyrics and all synthesized. And that was really, really successful. So where you do see this innovation happening, it was successful. So I don't think it's that people lost the capacity or interest in innovation. It's just that the system itself couldn't quite build up these new things that excited people the way that they did in the 20th century.
I also feel like part of the nostalgia kind of moment, or the I don't want to say like flood of nostalgia that we kind of find ourselves in, but I do think that everything is connected, right? And I think that it's not a coincidence that while there's, rising levels or kind of more reports of people being diagnosed with anxiety or depression, I think that's connected to, having smartphones in our pockets and having access to more information than our brains evolved to be able to process at any given time. But it also seems to me that there's, even though there's no real main monoculture left, it seems like maybe the thing that unites us most is this kind of foreboding sense of dread that everyone feels, and that things are always off, and that things are not moving in the right direction, and the internet's terrible and everything's terrible, and there's all this darkness everywhere. I feel like that connects a lot of us, and I feel like we, with nostalgia, are able to go back to a time where it's like, hey, you remember when you didn't feel all these things? Doesn't it feel good to be a kid again, watching this
Mm-hmm.
thing or engaging with this thing that you reminds you of a time where you didn't have this oppression on you all the time, on your mental health. But I did think it was interesting, and Isabelle and I were connecting about this earlier, and you had said so yourself earlier, David, about how the second half of the book, it gets much darker and it starts off kind of, a little bit more, talking about the poptimism and, oh, this is kind of fun, nostalgic kind of stuff. But then the second half of the book, I would stop reading a chapter and I would just lay awake at night, just staring up at the ceiling, being like, where are we going? What happened? What's going on in this world? But I was curious to hear how that experience writing that book, if that affected you emotionally, your mental health, like how did diving into the weeds on all that did it take a toll on you?
Absolutely. And I finished the book and I was like, well, I've been radicalized by myself. And so I went into this year being like, yeah, there's got to be another way, and I have to play a part in, shepherding us to that. I've done a pretty bad job of weaning myself off the apps, but at least like I'm starting to realize, okay, I should spend more time with real people. I
Mm.
recently went to China and I got caught behind the Great Firewall. And so I actually had no internet for 5 days, basically. And the first day was pretty stressful because I couldn't tell anyone who relied on me that I was unavailable. But then once a couple of days went by and I was just like living in the moment and not like I'd pick up my phone and be like, oh yeah, I can't do anything on here. It was quite nice in living in the moment. And so I guess the question one of like the value statements that we have in our heads that we don't challenge that much is just the internet will in our smartphones and these devices will always make our lives more convenient because they did for a long time. I mean,
Hmm.
if you ever tried to get somewhere in Tokyo before Google Maps, it was impossible. People are like, oh, the third right, and then there's a convenience store, and then you go 2 corners, over from that. So now anybody can get anywhere in any city they've ever been to. So all of these products were really convenient and made our lives better for a long time. Now we're getting to a point where they don't add much marginal value, and we're all starting to remember, oh, there were good things about an analog experience. There were good things about having to wait, and there were good things about scarcity in the sense that if you have all the world's music versus someone gives you one record and you have to really, enjoy that record. So humans, because we value all those things, we can always go back to them. And I think one of the challenges for our era is to create a banner for this idea of we're going to go back to the thing that makes humans happy without it being anti-technology Luddite. We're
Hmm.
rejecting all of this and just going back. It doesn't have to be going back. It could be moving forward. And so, that to me was, I think my major change is to realize, okay, we can't go any more that direction without it really making us feel worse on a day-to-day basis. And so I'm going to try to figure out what in my life makes me happy again. And it's, reading books and talking to people in real life and not looking at my phone and realizing, oh, I just had like the best 5 hours. What was that? It's like, oh, I couldn't find my phone for 5 hours. So once you start making those realizations, I think you can start shifting value over. But the problem of our phones are not just places for us to consume social media or post or whatever, but they're also kind of social obligation machines in the sense of like everyone who needs you is going to be, bugging you on your devices. And then the expectation on a chat app is you get back to them immediately. And so we have to also create this new social code of like, let's leave each other alone for a bit so that we can be in the moment. And, I'll get to you at some point. But so yeah, I mean, I do think this is a 25 years of if we said yes to everything, if we said yes to capitalism and yes to technology taking over our lives, because with the promise that it's all going to work out at the end, this is what we got. And so
Hmm.
there may be some people who are like, this is the best. What are you talking about? But I think there's a lot of people who understand that we have to stop and try to figure out what the next thing would be that actually makes us feel better. Because I think you're right that things feel worse. And the nostalgia does come from the fact that movies used to be slower paced and they used to have less uh, computer graphics and they just looked calmer and music sounded had a better harmonic range when it was real instruments. And it's not to be a snob to say that things digital are bad or that digital graphics are bad. It's just that there's something naturally soothing about some of these older art forms. And so it just makes sense that if you feel information overload, you don't want to watch the new Transformers, that you want to watch a really boring art film from the 60s because it's just slower and grainy and will calm you down.
It almost, I think that's such a powerful point, and it makes me think that the our lack of culture that we're currently experiencing is almost like a canary in a coal mine, sort of like, yeah, I think culture, the foundation of culture, it depends on us interacting with each other and having those real experiences. Because if you invest all of the time and energy and money into the internet or to your smartphone, this is, like you said, this is what you get. Like we invested all of this into our phones. It turns out that doesn't actually, it generates a very robust online culture, but it leaves us with very little else. In terms of when you were researching this book and you were writing it, were there any threads that, because you include so much in it, was there any part that you were like, this is almost relevant enough to include my book, but I gotta leave it on the editing room floor?
I mean, I wish I could say that I was the person who made those calls. I mean, my editor very heroically was like, why is Terry Richardson on every page of this book?" So I think there was a lot of
He was the
things that,
villain to me.
yeah, no, it's like you need, not everyone can be a bad guy. So there was a lot of stuff that was cut. I think the one thing that was cut that I'm still upset about is the fact that the Paris Hilton sex tape opened up with an image of the American flag that said September 11th, 2001, never forget. So that it's like these really quirky, crazy things that sometimes were cut, and sometimes they were cut, and I was like, no, that has to go back because just to give you a sense of humor about it all. Things that I mean, I think it was just tightened. There was just a lot more examples of. I probably had one too many pages about Vampire Weekend. It's just like things that were really textually rich that you could analyze. I felt the need to kind of analyze them out to as much as they could be analyzed. But and I mean, from that sense, I think the most successful chapter to me is the Kimye chapter about just Kim and Kanye coming together because it's really short and tight, and it just makes this really clear point that like without too much fat that these two people merging was kind of like the creation of the culture we have now, which is you had
Mhm.
somebody who had I don't know if you ever play that game, Katamari Damacy, where you like are this ball and you roll and you pick up stuff and just get bigger and bigger. But
Hmm.
Kanye had gone through and you know brought the two kinds of hip hop together, and R&B and soul and indie music and indie fashion and Paris fashion, and then but there still was this bridge between high fashion, Vogue, that and reality TV, and I think Kim represented the reality TV world, and them coming together helped kind of then bridge all of that together. Now we don't even think of a difference at all. We wouldn't be shocked if we had a reality TV star on the cover of a glossy magazine at all. So, um, you know, I there definitely could be there's definitely things I didn't write about at all that I would want someone else to go and write great books about. I didn't cover books, especially fiction, well enough. I really recommend a book called Immediacy by Anna Korbela. She's a um, scholar who writes a lot about the aesthetics of our time and does much more about fiction. And then gaming is another thing that's just a massive part of our culture now,
Hmm.
that I didn't, it pops up once in a while, but I didn't quite give it as much attention. So there was just whole fields that I couldn't talk about. I think over indexing music from one perspective is maybe not a good way to look at the 21st century, because music is just matters a lot less. But some of our biggest stars, Taylor Swift, Beyonce, Kanye, I mean, they all came from music. Their transition away from music, in a sense, is the story in itself. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, someone else would have written this book very, very differently, and I think that it's such a broad topic that I'm excited to see how someone else would tell the same story. And then the other thing I would love is for someone probably younger to write the same history with a positive spin, to really pull out uh, what is good about these years. I think that's a harder task, because even the really creative TikToks or vertical videos or whatever the format is of our moment, they just are much more ephemeral. And so it's harder to point to
Hmm.
them and say, this was this really defining moment, if most people don't know what it is. Whereas, people, even if you don't listen to Taylor Swift, you know who she is in a way that you don't know who a big TikTok star is. Anyway, but yeah, I mean, the book was about having to pick specific things to talk about, and it couldn't have everything, but it probably still had too much when I turned it in. I mean, I turned it in at 110,000 words and ended up at 85,000 words, and then it still had 50,000 pages. Sorry, 50,000 words of notes, and so we had to figure out how to. We couldn't actually trim the notes that much, but we had to figure out how to like do the layout so that the book wasn't one third notes.
I know you mean fiction when you're talking about wishing you could have included more books in here, but I actually have a note to talk to you about the great books that you did include. So I am surprised to hear you say that, because I love Amanda Montell, Emily
Hmm.
Nussbaum. I mean, you talk about cultish, the age of magical overthinking, and Cue the Sun in this book.
Yep.
I wonder if there are any, I know you just gave us one, if there are any other next steps for listeners that you would recommend as, required reading when they go pick up your book in the store.
Yeah, so I just mentioned this book, which I think is really important,
Hmm.
immediacy. Um, John Gans did this great book, When the Clock Broke, about the 90s, but I think it
Yep.
presages a lot of what happens in the book. I didn't mention it, but Francis Fukuyama had a book called Liberalism and Its Discontents, that I think, whether you politically agree with him or not, I think he charts the fact that liberalism in its kind of 90s form was rejected in the 21st century from both sides. And I think that kind of informs a lot of what I'm saying. Filter World by Kyle Chayka, I think, really shows the later half of this period, how algorithms have shaped things. Caitlin Tiffany's got an incredible book about One Direction fandom, that she goes really deep on that if you want a sense of what that world is like. But yeah,
I
I mean,
was
there's
deep in that world.
yeah. So that, I mean, that's a fantastic book. So I really am always grateful. I write kind of these books that are synthesis of a lot of material, and so I'm always incredibly grateful when people go deep in something to be able to pull things out. But yeah, I mean, there hasn't been a lot of books that are cultural histories of the 21st century. I tried to read everyone I could get my hands on, um, but yeah, I'm definitely in debt to all these incredible writers.
Well, I know that we are almost just about out of time, and you've been very generous with your time today, David. Before we go, is there anything that's coming up in your future that you want to share? What's next for you? Obviously, Blank Space is coming out this fall. It's going to be starting a lot of conversations, and it's going to do very well. But do you have anything on your horizon at the moment?
So I'll be in New York to launch the book on launch days of November 18th, and I have a newsletter that's called Culture, an owner's manual at culture.ghost.io that is where I'll be posting follow-ups to the book and snarky responses to critique and things like that. So yeah, I mean, that will be the best way to follow kind of what's in the future. I promised myself not to think about what my next book would be until this one came out. And then this summer I was like, oh, I know what my next book is. So I've already started reading towards that. But I mean, it's always a pendulum swing in the sense that, as I said, this book kind of radicalized me and I think has made me, I don't love writing a book that is negative. I don't love being the person who's the school marm, kind of telling everyone they did it wrong. But so I really want to take that energy of optimism, positivity, and find a theme that's much more talking about something I'm excited about. So that's I won't say any more than that, but that's kind of the direction I'm moving now.
Well, that's very exciting. We'll be looking forward to that, and hopefully you'll stop by again on the podcast once that is coming out. Until then, though, the new book is Blank Space, A Cultural History of the 21st Century. I encourage everybody listening to go pick up a copy at their local Barnes & Noble store or online at bn.com. I think, and I say this really honestly, it was one of my favorite books that I read this year, and it's going to stay with me for a long time. So I really appreciate you writing it. I really appreciate all the work that you put into it, and I appreciate you stopping by this morning.
Thank you so much for having me and dealing with the difficult time zone.
No problem at all. Isabelle, thank you also for being online. I appreciate it. Thank you for introducing me to people like Halsey and all the other names that I jotted down that I have to go look up.
That's what I'm here for. Thanks so much.
All right, take care.
Okay, thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.